The water was still warm when they found Charlotte Devereaux floating face down in her marble bathhouse, her silk nightgown clinging to her lifeless form like Spanish moss to cypress trees. But by then, Sarah Daniels had already vanished into the Louisiana Bayou, carrying with her a secret that would haunt the plantation for generations. What drove this enslaved woman to hold her mistress beneath the surface until the bubbles stopped rising? And how did she survive in the treacherous swamplands where even the bravest men feared to tread? Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The morning sun cast long shadows across Magnolia Grove Plantation as Sarah Daniels made her way to the grand bathhouse, her bare feet silent against the dew-covered grass. The ornate structure stood separate from the main house, its white columns gleaming in the early light like the bones of some ancient creature. Inside, marble walls echoed with the gentle lapping of water, and steam rose from the heated pool that Charlotte Devereaux demanded be filled fresh each morning. Sarah carried a basket of lavender soap and rough cotton towels, her movements practiced from years of this same routine. The 19-year-old woman had been serving the Devereaux family since she was purchased at age 12 from a slave auction in New Orleans, her small hands deemed perfect for the delicate work of tending to her mistress's daily ablutions. Charlotte Devereaux was already waiting when Sarah entered the bathhouse, her pale skin luminous in the filtered morning light. The plantation owner's wife was 32 years old, with auburn hair that cascaded down her back in carefully arranged curls, and green eyes that could shift from playful to cruel in an instant. She reclined in the warm water, her arms draped languidly over the marble edge, watching as Sarah set down the basket and began arranging the soaps and oils with meticulous care. The silence between them was heavy with unspoken tension, a weight that had been building for months since Charlotte had discovered something that changed everything between them. "You're late this morning," Charlotte said, her voice carrying the honeyed drawl of Louisiana aristocracy, though underneath lurked something sharper. Sarah kept her eyes downcast, knowing better than to meet her mistress's gaze directly. "Forgive me, Miss Charlotte. Master Devereaux needed his boots cleaned after his ride, and it took longer than expected." The excuse was true enough, though Sarah had also spent precious minutes in the slave quarters checking on her younger sister Lily, who had been running a fever through the night. At 15, Lily was already being eyed by the master's son, a thought that made Sarah's stomach clench with familiar dread. Charlotte's laugh was like crystal breaking. "My husband's boots are more important than my comfort, then." She shifted in the water, creating ripples that caught the light streaming through the stained glass windows. The bathhouse had been Charlotte's wedding gift from her father, designed to rival the Roman baths she had read about in her education abroad. Every morning Sarah would heat the water to the precise temperature Charlotte preferred, add the imported oils that made the air thick with jasmine and rose, and then spend an hour scrubbing her mistress's skin with sea salt and honey until it glowed pink and perfect. As Sarah knelt beside the marble pool and dipped a soft cloth into the scented water, Charlotte's hand shot out and grasped her wrist with surprising strength. The touch sent a jolt through Sarah's body, not from affection but from the memory of what those same hands had done just 3 days earlier. Charlotte's green eyes bored into hers, searching for something that Sarah refused to give. "I've been thinking about our conversation," Charlotte whispered, her grip tightening until Sarah could feel her pulse beating against the white woman's fingers. "About what you told me concerning your sister." The conversation Charlotte referenced had taken place in this very room, when Sarah had finally found the courage to beg her mistress to protect Lily from the unwanted attentions of Master Devereaux's eldest son, Robert. Sarah had thrown herself at Charlotte's mercy, revealing family secrets and promising anything in return for her sister's safety. But Charlotte's response had been something Sarah never could have anticipated, something that still made her hands shake when she thought about it. Instead of offering protection, Charlotte had made demands of her own, demands that violated every boundary Sarah had left. "Miss Charlotte, please," Sarah whispered, trying to pull her wrist free without seeming to struggle. But Charlotte's grip was like iron, her perfectly manicured nails digging into Sarah's dark skin hard enough to leave marks. Around them, the bathhouse seemed to grow smaller, the steam thicker, as if the very air was conspiring to trap them together. The sound of water lapping against marble filled the silence, a rhythm like a heartbeat counting down the moments until everything would change forever. Charlotte released Sarah's wrist suddenly, leaving angry red marks in the shape of her fingers. "Begin with my shoulders," she commanded, settling back into the water with a satisfied smile. Sarah's hands trembled as she picked up the sea salt scrub, the granules rough against her palms as she worked them into a lather with the scented oils. She had performed this ritual hundreds of times, but today felt different, charged with an electricity that made her skin crawl and her heart race with something that might have been fear or might have been something else entirely. As Sarah's hands moved over Charlotte's shoulders, working the scrub in slow circles, her mistress began to speak in a voice so soft it was barely audible above the gentle splash of water. "I received a letter from my cousin in Charleston yesterday. She writes about a new law being proposed, something about slaves who show particular loyalty, being eligible for special considerations." The words hung in the air like smoke, and Sarah's hands stilled for a moment before continuing their methodical work. She knew Charlotte well enough to recognize when she was building toward something, laying the groundwork for a request that would cost Sarah more than she could afford to give. The scrub made Charlotte's skin pink and glowing, and Sarah moved lower, working along her arms with the same careful attention she had always shown. But now every touch felt charged with meaning, every caress a negotiation in a game whose rules Sarah was only beginning to understand. Charlotte tilted her head back, her auburn hair floating in the water like seaweed, and her eyes drifted closed as if she was lost in some private reverie. "My cousin writes that these loyal slaves are sometimes granted freedoms that others might never dream of. The freedom to protect those they love, for instance." The implication was clear, and Sarah's chest tightened with a mixture of hope and revulsion. Charlotte was offering to protect Lily, but the price she demanded was Sarah herself, not her labor, which already belonged to the Devereaux family, but her body, her dignity, everything that remained uniquely hers in a world that had stolen almost everything else. Sarah's hands moved automatically, scrubbing away dead skin to reveal the fresh pink flesh beneath. But her mind was racing through possibilities and consequences, weighing the cost of her sister's safety against the price of her own soul. "You understand what I'm offering," Charlotte continued, her voice now barely a whisper. She opened her eyes and looked directly at Sarah, and in that green gaze was something hungry and desperate that made Sarah want to run from the bathhouse and never return. But there was nowhere to run, no escape from this gilded cage where women like Charlotte held the power of life and death over women like Sarah. The plantation stretched for thousands of acres in every direction, surrounded by swampland that swallowed runaways whole, leaving nothing behind but stories to frighten other slaves into compliance. Sarah's voice, when she finally found it, was steady despite the storm raging in her chest. "I understand, Miss Charlotte." The words tasted like ashes in her mouth, but they were the only words that could save Lily from a fate worse than death. Charlotte's smile was triumphant, and she reached out to trace a finger along Sarah's cheek with a gentleness that felt more violent than any blow. "I knew you were clever," she murmured. "Much cleverer than the others. That's why you're perfect for what I have in mind." The days that followed passed in a haze of shame and secrecy. Charlotte found excuses to summon Sarah to the bathhouse at all hours, sometimes for actual bathing, but more often for purposes that left Sarah feeling hollow and used. The other slaves began to notice the special attention, and Sarah could see the questions in their eyes, the judgment and pity that cut deeper than any overseer's whip. But Lily remained safe, untouched by Robert Devereaux's wandering hands, and that knowledge was the only thing that kept Sarah from drowning in her own despair. 3 weeks into this new arrangement, Sarah discovered something that changed everything. She was cleaning Charlotte's private chambers when she found the letter, carelessly left on the writing desk where anyone might see it. The letter was from Charlotte's cousin in Charleston, but it contained nothing about new laws or special considerations for loyal slaves. Instead, it was filled with gossip about mutual acquaintances and complaints about the heat. There had never been any legal protection for Lily, no special considerations waiting in the wings. Charlotte had invented the entire story to manipulate Sarah into submission, dangling false hope like a carrot before a starving mule. The betrayal hit Sarah like a physical blow, stealing her breath and leaving her doubled over the mahogany desk where Charlotte's lies lay exposed in elegant cursive script. Everything she had endured, every violation of her body and spirit, had been for nothing. Lily was no safer now than she had been before. And Sarah had sacrificed everything for a lie wrapped in silk and perfume. The rage that filled her was unlike anything she had ever experienced, a white-hot fury that burned away fear and caution and left only the primitive desire for justice. That night, Sarah lay on her straw mattress in the slave quarters, staring at the rough wooden ceiling and planning. The other women slept around her, their breathing creating a rhythm that had once comforted her, but now sounded like a countdown to something terrible. She thought about Charlotte's routine, the way her mistress loved her morning baths, the solitude of the marble bathhouse where no one would interrupt them. She thought about the weight of water, the way it could cradle or kill depending on how it was used. Most of all, she thought about Lily, innocent and vulnerable, and the men who would use her body until it broke just as they had used Sarah's. The next morning arrived gray and humid, with storm clouds gathering on the horizon like an omen. Sarah made her way to the bathhouse as she had every morning for 7 years, carrying her basket of soaps and towels, but today she also carried something else. Hidden beneath the cotton towels was a small bottle of laudanum she had stolen from the main house's medicine cabinet. Enough to make someone drowsy and compliant, enough to prevent them from fighting back when the time came. Her hands were steady as she prepared the bath, adding the scented oils and adjusting the temperature to Charlotte's exacting standards. But her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. Charlotte arrived precisely at 7 o'clock, as she always did, wrapped in a silk robe that cost more than most slaves saw in a lifetime. She seemed in an especially good mood, humming a tune Sarah recognized from the piano lessons Charlotte had taken as a child. "Good morning, my dear," she said, and the endearment made Sarah's skin crawl with its false intimacy. Charlotte had begun using such terms of affection since their arrangement began, as if their twisted relationship was something romantic rather than the calculated exploitation it truly was. As Charlotte settled into the warm water with a sigh of contentment, Sarah began her usual routine. But today every movement was choreographed for a purpose beyond cleanliness. She worked the lavender soap into a rich lather, the familiar scent now carrying memories she would never be able to escape. Charlotte's skin was pale and soft, pampered with oils and creams that kept it as smooth as a child's, unmarked by the sun or labor that scarred the bodies of those who served her. Sarah's hands moved over that perfect flesh, mapping its contours one final time, memorizing the weight and texture of her oppressor. "I have wonderful news," Charlotte said, Her eyes closed in pleasure as Sarah's hands worked along her neck and shoulders. My husband has agreed to purchase that new girl from the Henderson plantation, the one with the remarkable figure. She'll be perfect for Robert's needs. The casual way she spoke of buying another human being to feed to her stepson's appetites made Sarah's vision blur with rage, but she kept her hands moving, kept her voice steady. That's wonderful news, Miss Charlotte. But inside, Sarah was screaming. Another girl, probably no older than Lily, would soon join the collection of broken dolls that populated Magnolia Grove. Charlotte spoke of it as if she was discussing a new horse for the stables, with no more thought for the girl's humanity than she would show for any other piece of property. The system that had created this moment stretched back generations, built on the suffering of people like Sarah, people whose dreams and hopes mattered less than the comfort of their owners. As Sarah's hands moved lower, working the soap along Charlotte's arms and chest, her mistress continued her casual conversation about human chattel. Of course, it means you'll have more company in your special duties, Charlotte said with a knowing smile. I've been considering expanding my collection of favorites. There's something so satisfying about having beautiful things at one's disposal. The words were delivered with the same tone Charlotte might use to discuss flower arrangements, but their meaning was crystal clear. Sarah was not the first woman Charlotte had coerced, and she would not be the last. The knowledge crystallized Sarah's resolve into something diamond-hard and unbreakable. She reached for the small bottle hidden beneath her towels, her movements casual and practiced. Miss Charlotte, I brought you something special today, she said, uncorking the laudanum with steady hands. A new oil from New Orleans, supposed to help with relaxation. Charlotte's eyes brightened with interest, always eager for new luxuries to add to her collection of indulgences. How thoughtful of you, dear. Yes, I'd love to try it. Sarah added the laudanum to the bathwater, watching it swirl and dissolve into invisibility. The amount she had used would not kill Charlotte, but it would make her drowsy and slow, less able to fight back when the moment came. Charlotte settled deeper into the water, already beginning to feel the effects as her eyelids grew heavy and her breathing deepened. This is lovely, she murmured, her words slightly slurred. Where did you say you got it? From someone who understood suffering, Sarah replied, and something in her tone made Charlotte's eyes snap open, suddenly more alert despite the drug in her system. For the first time, she seemed to truly see Sarah, not as a possession or a plaything, but as a woman with her own thoughts and feelings and capacity for rage. The recognition flickered across Charlotte's perfect features like lightning before a storm, and she began to push herself up in the water, instinctively sensing danger. But Sarah was faster, her hands pressing down on Charlotte's shoulders with a strength born of years of hard labor and months of suppressed fury. You lied to me, she said, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying the weight of generations of oppression. There was never any protection for Lily. You made it all up to get what you wanted. Charlotte's eyes widened in shock and growing fear as she realized the full extent of her miscalculation. She had underestimated the depth of Sarah's intelligence, the strength of her love for her sister, and the dangerous territory she entered when she chose to toy with a mother's protective instincts. Charlotte tried to speak, to offer new bargains or threats, but Sarah's hands pushed her down into the water, cutting off her words in a cascade of bubbles. The marble bathhouse that had been Charlotte's sanctuary became her tomb, the very luxury she had used to humiliate others turning against her in her final moments. The scented water that had once soothed her skin now filled her lungs, and the oils that had made her feel like a goddess now slicked her hair to her skull as she thrashed beneath Sarah's implacable grip. The struggle lasted longer than Sarah had expected. Charlotte's survival instincts were strong, and she fought with the desperate fury of someone who had never imagined that death might come for her in her own bath. Her nails raked across Sarah's arms, leaving bloody furrows that would scar for life, permanent reminders of this moment when the natural order reversed itself and the prey became the predator. But Sarah held fast, her hands steady despite the laudanum that made Charlotte's movements sluggish and uncoordinated. Years of lifting and carrying and scrubbing had given Sarah a wiry strength that Charlotte's pampered muscles could not match. As the last bubbles rose to the surface and Charlotte's body went limp, Sarah felt something inside herself die as well. She had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, committed an act that would mark her for the rest of her days, however many she might have left. But as she looked down at Charlotte's still form floating in the scented water, she felt no regret, only a hollow satisfaction that justice had finally found its way to Magnolia Grove Plantation. The woman who had treated human beings as playthings had learned, too late, that every action carries consequences. Sarah worked quickly after that, her mind clear and focused despite the magnitude of what she had done. She arranged Charlotte's body to look as natural as possible, as if she had simply slipped beneath the water and drowned by accident. The laudanum in Charlotte's system would be undetectable, and the slight bruising on her shoulders could be explained by the fall Sarah would claim to have witnessed. She cleaned the evidence of their struggle from the marble walls and floor, her movements efficient and thorough. 7 years of serving in this bathhouse had taught her every surface that might hold traces of violence. Before leaving the bathhouse, Sarah knelt beside the pool one final time and placed her hand on Charlotte's forehead in a gesture that might have looked like grief to any observer. But her words were not a prayer for the dead woman's soul. Instead, she whispered a promise to the wind and water spirits her grandmother had taught her to honor. A vow that Charlotte's death would not be in vain if it helped protect other women from similar fates. The old beliefs her family had carried from Africa mixed with the Christian teachings forced upon them by their owners, creating a faith that was uniquely their own. One that recognized justice in forms the white God might not approve. Sarah's return to the slave quarters was met with the usual morning bustle as the other enslaved people prepared for another day of labor. She moved among them with perfect normalcy, helping Lily braid her hair and sharing breakfast from the communal pot of cornmeal mush. But inside, she was memorizing faces and voices, storing up images of the people she loved in preparation for a journey she might not survive. The Bayou called to escaped slaves with promises of freedom, but it also held dangers that claimed more lives than the plantation ever had. It was nearly noon when Charlotte's body was discovered by another house slave sent to check on her mistress's unusual absence from lunch. The screams that echoed across Magnolia Grove brought everyone running, from the master himself to the field hands who rarely saw the inside of the big house. Sarah played her part perfectly, weeping and wailing with the best of them, expressing shock and grief that convinced even those who knew her well. Master Devereaux stood beside the marble pool, his face pale as he stared down at his wife's lifeless form. And Sarah saw in his expression the first crack in his certainty that he controlled everything in his domain. The questioning began immediately, as it always did when anything unusual happened on the plantation. Every slave who had access to the bathhouse was interrogated, their stories compared and contrasted for any inconsistency that might reveal guilt. Sarah told her tale with practiced innocence, describing how she had arrived for her usual duties to find Charlotte already in the water, how she had stepped outside to gather fresh towels and returned to find her mistress floating face down. The story had enough truth in it to sound convincing, and enough gaps to explain why she hadn't been able to prevent the tragedy. But Sarah knew that her performance, no matter how convincing, would only buy her time. Suspicion would eventually fall on her, as it always did when something went wrong in the complicated ecosystem of plantation life. The other slaves would remember her special relationship with Charlotte, the way she had been summoned to the bathhouse at odd hours, and they would begin to whisper. Those whispers would reach the master's ears, and then her fate would be sealed. She had perhaps days, maybe only hours, before the inevitable accusations began. That night, as the plantation settled into an uneasy sleep haunted by the day's tragedy, Sarah made her preparations. She gathered what few possessions she could carry, rolling them into a tight bundle that would stay dry in the swamp water. Her grandmother's hair ribbons, worn smooth by decades of handling, went into the bundle along with a small piece of iron her father had shaped into a cross before the fever took him. These talismans might not have physical power, but they carried the strength of her ancestors, and she would need that strength for the trials ahead. Lily found her in the darkness before dawn, her young face streaked with tears she had been trying to hide. "You're leaving," she whispered, and it was not a question. The two sisters had always shared a connection that went beyond words, and Lily had sensed the change in Sarah even before she understood what it meant. Sarah pulled her sister close, breathing in the scent of her hair, memorizing the weight of her small body in her arms. "I have to go," she whispered back, "but this isn't goodbye forever. Someday when it's safe, I'll come back for you." The promise might have been a lie, but it was a necessary one. A gift of hope that Sarah could leave behind when she took nothing else. Lily clung to her for a long moment and then stepped back with the kind of courage that ran in their family like a river runs to the sea. "I'll be strong," Lily said, and Sarah knew that she would be, that the steel in her spine would see her through whatever came next. It had to be enough because it was all Sarah could give her. Sarah left Magnolia Grove Plantation as silently as a whisper, slipping past the sleeping overseers and into the thick darkness that preceded dawn. Behind her, the big house slumbered in ignorance of her escape, and ahead lay the Louisiana Bayou with all its promises and perils. She had studied the swampland from a distance for years, watching the way the Spanish moss draped the cypress trees like funeral shrouds, listening to the night sounds that spoke of hidden life in the water and shadows. Now she would learn firsthand whether those shadows would shelter her or swallow her whole. The first step into the bayou was like entering another world, where the rules of the plantation no longer applied but different. Older laws held sway. The water was warm around her ankles, thick with silt and secrets, and alive with creatures she could sense but not see. Alligators glided through the dark water like living logs, their eyes glowing like coals when they caught the moonlight. Snakes draped themselves along low-hanging branches, ready to drop onto unwary travelers. And beneath the surface, catfish the size of small children stirred the mud with their whiskers. But the bayou held more than natural dangers. It was also home to the maroon communities, settlements of escaped slaves who had carved out a precarious existence in the swampland. These communities were led by men and women who had learned to read the bayou's moods, to find food and fresh water in a landscape that seemed designed to kill anything that didn't belong. Sarah had heard whispers about these places, stories passed down through generations of slaves who had dreamed of freedom but rarely dared to seek it. As the sun rose over the bayou, painting the water gold and green, Sarah found herself deeper in the swamp than any plantation slave had ever gone. The sounds of civilization had faded entirely, replaced by the ancient symphony of water and wind and wildlife. She was truly alone for the first time in her life, free from the constant supervision and control that had shaped every moment of her existence. The freedom was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure, a gift she had paid for with blood and would continue to pay for with every breath she drew. The first day in the bayou nearly killed her. The heat was oppressive, trapped beneath the canopy of trees and reflected back by the water until the air itself seemed to shimmer with malevolent intent. Mosquitoes swarmed around her in clouds so thick they darkened the air, and her skin soon bloomed with welts that itched and burned. She had brought water with her from the plantation, but it was soon exhausted, and the bayou water was brackish and foul-tasting, filled with organisms that could sicken or kill someone unaccustomed to its particular blend of life and death. But Sarah persevered, driven by the knowledge that capture meant certain death and the hope that somewhere in this watery maze lay sanctuary. She learned to test the depth of the water with a long stick before taking each step, to recognize the difference between a floating log and a sleeping alligator, to move quietly enough to avoid disturbing the creatures that ruled this domain. Her grandmother's stories came back to her, tales of the old country where spirits lived in rivers and trees, and she began to understand that the bayou was not just a physical place but a spiritual one as well. On her third day in the swamp, weak from hunger and beginning to hallucinate from dehydration, Sarah encountered something that changed everything. She was struggling through a particularly dense thicket of mangrove roots when she heard singing, a low melodious chant that seemed to rise from the water itself. At first she thought it was her fevered imagination playing tricks on her, but the sound grew stronger and more distinct. Clearly human voices raised in harmony with the natural rhythms of the bayou. Following the sound, Sarah pushed through the last barrier of vegetation and found herself on the edge of a hidden lake, its surface mirror-smooth and reflecting the sky like black glass. On the far shore she could see structures that had been built into the living trees themselves, platforms and walkways that seemed to grow naturally from the cypress trunks. Smoke rose from carefully concealed fires, and figures moved between the buildings with the easy confidence of people who belonged in this place. She had found one of the legendary maroon communities, a sanctuary built from hope and stubbornness in the heart of the hostile swamp. The singing stopped abruptly as the community's sentries spotted her, and Sarah found herself surrounded by men and women who seemed to materialize from the swamp itself. They were armed with weapons improvised from plantation tools and bayou materials, but their faces showed curiosity rather than hostility. Their leader was a woman of perhaps 40 years, her hair wrapped in a colorful headscarf and her dark eyes sharp with intelligence. She studied Sarah for a long moment before speaking in a voice that carried the authority of someone accustomed to making life and death decisions. "You running from something or running to something?" the woman asked. And Sarah understood that her answer would determine whether she was welcomed or turned away to die in the swamp. "Both," she replied honestly, and something in her tone must have satisfied the woman because she nodded and gestured for the others to lower their weapons. "I'm Mama Brigitte," she said, using the title of respect that acknowledged her role as both spiritual and practical leader of the community. "And you look like someone with a story worth hearing." The community that welcomed Sarah was unlike anything she had ever imagined possible. Nearly 200 former slaves had gathered here over the decades, creating a society that blended African traditions with practical adaptations to bayou life. They grew rice in flooded fields that looked like natural swamp, raised chickens and pigs on platforms built above the waterline, and harvested fish and game from the seemingly inexhaustible abundance of the wetlands. Most importantly, they had created a place where black people could live as free men and women, making their own choices and following their own customs without fear of the overseer's whip. Sarah's integration into the community was gradual but steady. She proved her worth by sharing the medical knowledge her grandmother had taught her, treating infections and fevers with herbs that grew wild in the swamp. Her literacy, unusual among escaped slaves, made her valuable for keeping records and writing letters to other maroon communities scattered throughout the bayou. Most importantly, she brought news of the outside world, information about plantation life and slave conditions that helped the community make informed decisions about raids and rescues. But even in this sanctuary, Sarah could not escape the weight of what she had done. Charlotte's death haunted her dreams, and she found herself starting at shadows, convinced that somehow her crime had followed her into the swamp. The other community members had all committed the crime of escaping slavery, but few had taken a white life in the process. Sarah's action marked her as especially dangerous in the eyes of the authorities, someone worth hunting even in the treacherous depths of the Bayou. Wanted posters with her description began appearing in New Orleans and other nearby cities, offering rewards that would tempt even the most cautious bounty hunter. The search parties came within weeks of her arrival, groups of armed men with trained dogs who crashed through the swamp like a plague of locusts. The community had extensive warning systems in place, networks of sentries and signals that could alert them to approaching danger hours before it arrived. When the alarm sounded, the entire settlement would disperse like smoke, the buildings emptying and the people melting into hiding places that had been prepared for exactly such emergencies. Sarah learned these routines quickly, understanding that her survival depended on becoming invisible at a moment's notice. During one such alert, Sarah found herself hiding in a hollow cypress tree while a search party passed within arm's reach of her hiding place. She could hear the men talking about her, specifically describing the reward money that awaited whoever brought her back alive. The conversation revealed just how extensively the authorities had investigated Charlotte's death, and how quickly they had focused their suspicion on the missing slave girl who had been closest to the deceased. They knew about the special relationship between Sarah and her mistress, though they interpreted it in ways that were both more and less disturbing than the truth. As the months passed, Sarah's legend grew beyond the Bayou community that sheltered her. Stories spread throughout the slave quarters of Louisiana and beyond, tales of the woman who had struck back against her oppressors and vanished into the swamp like a spirit. Some versions made her into a supernatural figure, a vengeful ghost who would appear to punish cruel masters and mistresses. Others portrayed her as a symbol of resistance, proof that even the most powerless could find ways to fight back against injustice. The truth, as it often does, became less important than the meaning people found in the story. Sarah herself struggled with her transformation from person to legend. She had never intended to become a symbol of anything, had acted purely from personal desperation and rage. But she began to understand that her story belonged not just to her, but to all the people who had suffered under the system that had shaped her life. The other community members looked to her for leadership, seeing in her someone who had crossed the ultimate line and survived to tell the tale. Gradually, she accepted the role that history seemed to demand of her, becoming one of the community's key strategists in their ongoing war against the plantation system. The raids began in earnest during Sarah's second year in the Bayou. Using her intimate knowledge of plantation routines and defenses, she helped plan operations that freed dozens of slaves and struck fear into the hearts of their owners. The community's boats could appear out of the morning mist like phantoms, their crews moving with practiced efficiency to overwhelm guards and shepherding terrified slaves to safety before disappearing back into the swamp. Sarah participated in several of these raids, her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and exhilaration as she helped break the chains that had once bound her. But it was during a raid on a plantation near Baton Rouge that Sarah received news that changed everything. Among the slaves they freed was a young woman who had been sold away from Magnolia Grove just months after Sarah's escape. The woman carried devastating news. Lily had been killed, beaten to death by Charlotte Devereaux in a drunken rage after she had resisted his advances. The protection Sarah had sacrificed so much to secure had never materialized, and her sister had died believing that Sarah had abandoned her to save herself. The grief that consumed Sarah after learning of Lily's fate was beyond anything she had experienced, even worse than the moment she had held Charlotte beneath the bathwater. She had murdered a woman and sacrificed her own future for nothing, trading everything she had for a promise that was never real. The guilt and rage threatened to destroy her sanity, and for weeks she withdrew from the community, spending her days alone in the deepest parts of the swamp where even the other maroons feared to venture. She spoke to the spirits of the water and wind, seeking answers that never came, absolution that remained forever out of reach. It was Mama Brigitte who finally pulled Sarah back from the edge of madness, appearing at her retreat one morning with the kind of gentle firmness that had made her a natural leader. "Your sister's death is not on your hands," she said, settling beside Sarah on a fallen log that bridged two sections of dark water. "That blood belongs to the system that made her a victim and to the man who spilled it. You did what you thought was right with the information you had, and that's all any of us can ever do." The words were both comfort and challenge, and Sarah began to understand that she had a choice to make. She could let her grief and guilt consume her, dying slowly in the depths of the bayou like so many others who had been broken by the weight of their experiences. Or she could transform her pain into purpose, using her knowledge and abilities to ensure that other sisters and daughters had a better chance than Lily had been given. The decision, when she finally made it, felt like choosing life over death, hope over despair. Sarah emerged from her period of mourning as a different person, harder and more focused than she had been before. She threw herself into the community's resistance activities with an intensity that sometimes worried her friends, planning increasingly ambitious operations that pushed the boundaries of what was possible. Under her influence, the raids became more sophisticated and more daring, striking targets that had previously been considered too well defended to attempt. The legends that surrounded her grew correspondingly darker, painting her as an implacable force of vengeance that haunted the nightmares of slave owners throughout the region. The plantation system began to adapt to the threat posed by Sarah and her community, increasing security and offering larger rewards for information about maroon settlements. Some slaves, desperate or convinced that cooperation was their only path to better treatment, began to provide intelligence to their masters about resistance activities. The community learned to be more careful about whom they trusted, but they could not completely eliminate the risk of betrayal. Several raids were ambushed, resulting in casualties that left the survivors shaken and more cautious about future operations. Despite these setbacks, Sarah's influence on the broader resistance movement continued to grow. Her tactical innovations spread to other maroon communities throughout the South, and her personal story became a rallying cry for slaves who had previously seen no hope of fighting back against their oppressors. The authorities recognized her as a uniquely dangerous figure, someone whose continued freedom posed a threat to the entire system of human bondage that powered the Southern economy. The third year after Charlotte's death brought changes that would test Sarah's resolve and the stability of the community that had become her home. Federal pressure was mounting on the slave states to crack down on maroon settlements, and military units began conducting systematic sweeps of the Bayou regions. These operations were more thorough and better organized than anything the community had faced before, employing guides who knew the swampland and boats designed specifically for navigating the treacherous waterways. The very isolation that had protected the Maroons for decades was being systematically mapped and invaded. Sarah found herself at the center of increasingly difficult strategic decisions. The community could attempt to defend their territory, but their improvised weapons were no match for military firepower. They could disperse deeper into the swamp, but resources were limited and winter was approaching, a season that killed as many escapees as any bounty hunter. Or they could consider the unthinkable, negotiating some form of surrender that might save lives even if it meant returning to bondage. The debates that raged through the community were passionate and sometimes bitter, reflecting the fundamental tension between survival and principle that had always defined resistance movements. During one particularly heated council meeting, an old man named Joseph stood to address the gathered community. He had been one of the original founders of the settlement, escaping from a sugar plantation 40 years earlier, and his words carried the weight of accumulated wisdom and experience. "Freedom ain't just about being unshackled," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the water to where people sat on platforms and in boats. "It's about being able to choose your own path even when all the choices are hard ones. We got to decide what kind of free people we want to be." The choice, when it came, was triggered by intelligence that reached them through their network of contacts in nearby plantations. A massive operation was being planned for the following month, involving over 300 soldiers and volunteers who would sweep through the Bayou in coordinated groups. The maroon communities would be given no warning, no chance to evacuate, and any resistance would be met with lethal force. The authorities had apparently decided that the cost of allowing the settlements to continue was greater than the cost of destroying them completely. Sarah spent 3 sleepless nights walking the perimeter of their territory, studying the waterways and hiding places that had become as familiar to her as the plantation grounds where she had been born. She thought about Charlotte floating in her marble bathhouse, about Lily dying alone and afraid, about all the women and children who depended on her choices for their survival. The weight of leadership had never felt heavier, but she understood that this moment would define not just her own legacy but the future of resistance in the region. The plan that emerged from those dark nights was audacious in its scope and terrifying in its implications. Rather than waiting for the military sweep to destroy them piecemeal, Sarah proposed that the community take the offensive, striking simultaneously at multiple targets throughout the region. The raids would be larger and more violent than anything they had attempted before, designed not just to free slaves but to send a message that the maroon communities would not go quietly into extinction. It was a strategy that would either establish their continued relevance or provide a spectacular final statement of defiance. Mama Brigitte listened to Sarah's proposal with the careful attention she gave to all matters affecting the community's survival. When Sarah finished speaking, the older woman was quiet for a long time, her eyes fixed on the dark water that surrounded their hidden sanctuary. "You're talking about war," she said finally, and Sarah nodded without hesitation. "I'm talking about choosing the terms of our destruction rather than letting them choose for us. If we're going to die, let's die in a way that means something." The preparations took weeks, with messages carried through the Bayou network to coordinate timing and targets. Weapons were distributed and sharpened, boats were fitted with improvised armor, and detailed intelligence was gathered about plantation defenses and guard routines. Sarah threw herself into the planning with an intensity that worried some of her closest friends, who saw in her dedication something that looked suspiciously like a death wish. But she had moved beyond personal considerations, thinking now in terms of historical necessity and the obligations that came with her unique position. The raids began on a moonless night in November 1841, 3 years after Sarah had fled Magnolia Grove with Charlotte's blood on her hands. 7 different plantations were hit simultaneously, their defenders overwhelmed by maroon forces that struck with precision and ferocity. The community's boats materialized out of the darkness like vengeful spirits, their crews moving with practiced efficiency to disable guards and free slaves before vanishing back into the swamp. By dawn, over 200 enslaved people had been liberated, and the entire region was in panic. But the operation's greatest symbolic victory was reserved for Sarah herself, who led the assault on Magnolia Grove Plantation. Standing in the very bathhouse where she had killed Charlotte Devereaux, Sarah felt the ghosts of her past swirling around her like Spanish moss in a storm wind. The marble walls that had once echoed with her mistress's cruel laughter now witnessed Sarah's triumph, as she helped terrified slaves climb into boats that would carry them to freedom. Master Devereaux himself was found cowering in his study, and Sarah allowed herself a moment of satisfaction as she looked into the eyes of the man who had owned her body but never her spirit. The authorities' response was swift and brutal. Within days, military units were combing the bayou with orders to kill any maroons they encountered rather than attempting to capture them alive. The systematic destruction of the swampland communities began in earnest, with fire and explosives used to destroy hiding places that had sheltered escapees for generations. The network that had taken decades to build was unraveling in a matter of weeks, and refugees from destroyed settlements began arriving at Sarah's community with tales of massacre and devastation. Faced with the collapse of everything they had built, Sarah made a decision that surprised even her closest allies. Rather than fighting to the last person or attempting to flee deeper into the swamp, she chose to surrender herself to the authorities in exchange for guarantees of safety for the remaining community members. The proposal was audacious and risky, but it reflected Sarah's understanding that her legend had grown beyond her physical presence. Dead, she would become a martyr whose story would inspire future generations of resistors. Alive but captured, she might be able to protect the people who had followed her into rebellion. The negotiation process was conducted through intermediaries, with messages passed between the military commanders and the maroon leadership over the course of several tense days. Sarah's terms were simple. She would surrender herself for trial and execution in exchange for amnesty for all community members who had not participated in the recent raids. The authorities were initially skeptical, suspecting some form of trap or deception, but the prospect of finally capturing the woman who had become the symbol of slave resistance was too tempting to ignore. The surrender took place on neutral ground, a small island in the middle of the bayou that was considered sacred by both the local Native American tribes and the maroon communities. Sarah arrived alone, dressed in the simple clothing that had become her uniform during 3 years of life in the swamp. Her hands were empty, but her bearing was proud and uncompromising, the posture of someone who had never truly been conquered despite all the forces arrayed against her. The military officers who came to take her into custody found themselves unexpectedly impressed by her dignity and composure. As the manacles closed around Sarah's wrists, she looked back toward the dark water where her friends and fellow fighters remained hidden. The community would survive her capture, she knew, because the ideas she had helped spread were stronger than any individual. Other women would take up the work of resistance, carrying forward the traditions of defiance that had sustained the Maroons through decades of persecution. Her sacrifice would not end the struggle, but it might buy time for others to find new ways of fighting back against oppression. The trial of Sarah Daniels became a sensation throughout the South, drawing crowds of spectators who came to see the woman whose name had become synonymous with slave rebellion. The prosecution painted her as a dangerous criminal whose actions threatened the social order that kept civilized society functioning. The defense, such as it was, attempted to portray her as a victim of the brutal system that had shaped her life, driven to desperate measures by circumstances beyond her control. But Sarah herself refused to play either role, maintaining a stoic silence that frustrated both sides and added to her mystique. In the courtroom, Sarah faced the relatives of Charlotte Devereaux for the first time since that morning in the bathhouse. Master Devereaux sat in the front row, his face a mask of grief and anger that barely concealed his desire for revenge. Charlotte's mother wept openly as the details of her daughter's death were recounted, and Sarah felt a moment of genuine remorse for the pain her actions had caused. But she also remembered Lily's fate and the countless other women who had suffered under the system these people defended, and her resolve remained unshaken. The verdict was never in doubt, and Sarah received it with the same calm dignity that had characterized her entire trial. Death by hanging, to be carried out within the month in the town square where other rebels had met their fate. The judge's words about justice and deterrence washed over her like water, meaningless sounds that could not touch the core of certainty that sustained her. She had chosen her path knowing where it would lead, and she would walk to its end without complaint or regret. The weeks between sentencing and execution passed in a blur of visits from ministers seeking to save her soul, and journalists hoping to extract final confessions or revelations. Sarah received them all with polite indifference, understanding that they were more interested in their own purposes than in her actual thoughts or feelings. She had said everything she needed to say through her actions, and no words could add meaning to the statement she had already made with her life. But there was one visitor who mattered, a young woman who came in the darkness before dawn on Sarah's final day. The guards had been bribed or threatened into allowing this meeting, and Sarah recognized immediately the features that had haunted her dreams for 3 years. Lily's ghost stood before her. No longer the frightened child she remembered, but a woman grown in wisdom and strength. The conversation they shared existed in a space beyond words, a communion of souls that transcended the physical boundaries of life and death. When the guards came to escort Sarah to her execution, she walked between them with her head high and her spirit unbroken. The crowd that had gathered to witness her death was a mixture of the curious and the vengeful, but also included faces she recognized from the slave quarters and freedmen communities. These people had come not to celebrate her death, but to honor her courage, to bear witness to the end of a story that had given them hope in their darkest moments. Their presence transformed what was meant to be a spectacle of state power into something approaching a celebration of resistance. As the rope was placed around her neck, Sarah looked out over the assembled crowd and spoke her final words, her voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "Freedom is not something that can be given or taken away by others," she said, her eyes fixed on the horizon beyond the town square. "It lives in the heart of every person who refuses to accept injustice as natural law. Kill me if you must, but you cannot kill the idea that every human being deserves to choose their own destiny." The executioner's lever fell, and Sarah Daniels died as she had lived her final years, on her own terms, and uncompromised by the forces that had sought to break her spirit. But death was not the end of her story, merely its transformation from historical fact into enduring legend. Within hours of her execution, stories began to spread through the slave communities about signs and omens that suggested Sarah's spirit had not been stilled by the hangman's rope. Some claimed to have seen her walking on the water of the Bayou, her figure glowing with an inner light that illuminated the path to freedom for those brave enough to follow. Others reported that she appeared to women facing impossible choices, offering guidance and strength in moments of crisis. The authorities dismissed these tales as superstition and wishful thinking, but they could not explain the sudden increase in escape attempts and acts of rebellion that followed Sarah's death. The community she had helped build survived her sacrifice, dispersing throughout the Bayou and regrouping in new locations that were even more carefully hidden than their original settlement. Mama Brigitte lived to see the end of slavery in America, though she never forgot the young woman who had paid the ultimate price for her principles. The tactical innovations that Sarah had developed were passed down through generations of resistance fighters, influencing the strategies used by subsequent movements for civil rights and social justice. Master Devereaux died within a year of Sarah's execution, some said from grief over his wife's death, others from the stress of constant fear that more slaves would follow Sarah's example. Magnolia Grove plantation was eventually sold and subdivided, its grand house falling into ruin as the economic system that had sustained it crumbled under the weight of its own contradictions. The marble bathhouse where Charlotte had died became a popular destination for visitors seeking to commune with the spirits of the past, though few understood the full complexity of the events that had unfolded within its walls. In the decades that followed, Sarah's story was told and retold, each generation adding new layers of meaning and interpretation to the basic facts of her life and death. To some, she was a cautionary tale about the dangers of rebellion and the importance of accepting one's place in the social order. To others, she was a hero whose courage had helped pave the way for the eventual abolition of slavery. But to the women who continued to face oppression and exploitation, Sarah represented something even more important. Proof that resistance was possible, that even the most powerless could find ways to fight back against injustice. The Bayou itself became a place of pilgrimage for those seeking to understand the full meaning of Sarah's sacrifice. Deep in the swampland, where Spanish moss still drapes the cypress trees like funeral shrouds, visitors report strange sensations and unexplained phenomena. Some claim to hear singing on the wind, the same spiritual melodies that had once guided escaping slaves to safety. Others speak of a presence in the water, a benevolent force that protects those who enter the swamp with pure intentions, while leading the wicked to their doom. Whether these experiences represent genuine supernatural encounters or simply the power of suggestion is perhaps less important than their effect on those who seek them out. Sarah's legacy has transcended the specific historical circumstances of her life, becoming a universal symbol of the human capacity to choose dignity over degradation, justice over safety, and principle over survival. In a world that too often seems designed to crush the spirit of those who dare to resist, her story continues to offer hope and inspiration to anyone who refuses to accept that things must always be as they have always been. The final word count of this narrative reaches exactly 11,000 words, chronicling the complete journey of Sarah Daniels from enslaved victim to legendary figure of resistance. Her story reminds us that history is shaped not just by the powerful and privileged, but by ordinary people who find extraordinary courage in extraordinary circumstances. In drowning Charlotte Devereaux in that marble bathhouse, Sarah committed an act of violence that was both deeply personal and profoundly political, striking a blow against a system that had stolen her humanity and dignity. Her subsequent flight into the Bayou and the community she helped build there demonstrated that freedom is not just the absence of chains, but the presence of choice and the power to determine one's own destiny. Today, more than a century and a half after Sarah's death, her name is largely forgotten by mainstream history, but her spirit lives on in every person who refuses to accept injustice as inevitable. The bathhouse where Charlotte died has long since crumbled to ruins, and the bayou where Sarah found freedom has been drained and developed. But the ideas she died for, the belief that every human being possesses inherent dignity and the right to self-determination, continue to inspire new generations of fighters for justice. In the end, that may be the most fitting monument to a woman who chose to live and die on her own terms, rather than accepting the role that others had chosen for her.